Good evening, everyone. My name is Gaston Alonso. I am the director of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities at Brooklyn College, and I am honored and I am excited to welcome you to today's event, a celebration of Professor Matthew Lindauer's book, The Fruitfulness of Normative Concepts. We can please extend a round of virtual applause to Professor Lindauer. Congratulations. Now, this is the sixth in a seven-part series of the Wolf Institute is hosting to celebrate work by new work by Brooklyn College faculty. We have one more event in the series to celebrate English professor Matthew Burgess's latest book, Word with Wings and Magic Things, on November 20th. You can learn more about this event at the link that will be shared in the chat, and we invite you to join us. Also, a recording of this event will be available at the Wolves Institute YouTube channel, where you can find recordings of other events in the series, and that link has likewise been shared in the channel, in the chat. And lastly, please follow us on Instagram to learn more about our future programming. Now, out of respect for our speaker and for other attendees, we'll keep the microphones muted during the first part of tonight's program. We will reserve time for questions and comments after the presentation. Now, I am very excited for this evening's conversation, so let me introduce Professor Lindauer. Matthew Lindaeur is Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Brooklyn College, an Associate Professor in the Departments of Philosophy and Psychology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He specializes in moral and political philosophy, moral psychology, and experimental philosophy. His research, including the book that we celebrate today, focuses on the role that empirical facts should play in the evaluation of normative concepts. And with that, I am going to turn the microphone and the screen over to Matthew. Thank you so much, Matthew, for this wonderful gift that you're giving us with this book, and I look forward to learning from you tonight.
Thank you so much, Gaston, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to share my screen now. Here we go. Okay, so can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so as Gaston said, I'm going to be presenting on a new book of mine that just came out with Oxford University Press. There's a message in the chat. Yes, people can hear. Good. So the book is called The Fruitfulness of Normative Concepts, and you see here a piece of delicious fruit, my favorite fruit, the pomegranate, with a lock and a key. So I'll explain what the cover image refers to in the course of the talk. But I'm going to start the talk with a motivating contrast between two hypothetical cases. So consider case one. Philosophers like to have you consider hypothetical cases. So some of you who are not in philosophy, know about the trolley problem. That's a hypothetical case. Well, here's another one for you. Imagine that in a hypothetical universe much like ours, imagine that scientists have just developed a new theory of the basic building blocks of the universe. That theory posits the existence of subatomic particles and describes their qualities and the principles that guide their behavior. However, this theory also turns out to have devastating military applications, and if the theory is disseminated, it's likely that very destructive weapons will wind up being used, putting many people and even human existence in danger. Clearly not so hypothetical, not so far from our own world. So with this example in mind, now turn to the next example, case two. In a hypothetical universe much like ours, imagine that philosophers have just developed a new theory of justice. That theory is quite coherent and consistent and more wide-ranging than many other competing theories. However, if this theory is disseminated, people who implement the theory will fail to take account of the pervasiveness of racism and racial inequality in their societies, and racism and racial inequality in these societies will increase substantially as a result. Now, to me, and I hope to you, these cases seem to differ significantly, right? You might think of this difference as coming down to not just the topic, but whether or not facts about the practical effects of the theory being considered, in the first case of physical theory, in the second case of theory of justice, whether or not those facts about what will happen when the theory is disseminated matter in our evaluations of the relevant theory. Right? You might think, so much the worse for the world if discoveries about physics have these potentially devastating practical applications, but it doesn't seem like we look at theories of justice the same way. If theories of justice, if they were disseminated, they would lead to the increase in racism or other kinds of bias. You might think that that's a problem for the theory itself, right? That we would have an issue with that kind of theory of justice itself. Now, you might be, as some people are, like a thoroughgoing pragmatist who thinks that the practical effects of all kinds of theories, even scientific and maybe mathematical theories of certain kinds, matter in our evaluations of those theories. So if you are one such person, I might try to put the point slightly differently in terms of which practical effects matter and to what extent they do in the evaluation of the theory. But as I'll say in the course of the talk, you don't have to be this kind of thoroughgoing pragmatist who thinks that practical effects always matter to accept the kind of conclusion that I want you to accept about theories of justice and other theories regarding moral and political philosophy, um, moral and political concepts from moral and political philosophy, namely that we should evaluate them partly in terms of their practical effects. So I'm not going to lean too much on this initial contrast between these cases, but insofar as you're gripped by the idea that there's some deep difference between the way that practical effects matter in the evaluation of, on the one hand, physical theory, and on the other hand, a theory of a concept like justice, I hope that that's kind of a motivating contrast for taking interest in the project, introducing the project. So many theorists hold the view that the normative concepts employed in moral and political philosophy, in addition to being coherent and well motivated from a purely theoretical perspective, should be partly evaluated by the practical role that they play. And the extent to which moral and political concepts play their practical role well, I refer to as their fruitfulness. That's what's meant by fruitfulness in the title. And notably, I'm going to say that the fruitfulness of these concepts and specifications of them, norms, theories, and principles that fall under a concept, sometimes referred to both in the work of political philosophers like John Rawls, but also in contemporary work in cognitive science as a conception or specification of a concept. The fruitfulness of these items can only be determined with the help of empirical investigation. So in particular, determining whether or not a given moral or political concept will be fruitful in solving practical problems is a question that requires empirical evidence to answer. Now, insofar as assessing the fruitfulness of these concepts is part of doing philosophy with them, the kind of somewhat radical upshot of this project is that in order to do philosophy, you need to do empirical research. Again, because assessing their fruitfulness depends on empirical facts about their practical effects. Now, there are at least 5 important dimensions of fruitfulness, this kind of practical problem-solving capacity of concepts that I delineate in this book: motivation, prevention, resilience, consensus, and guidance. And I'll walk you through those and give a few case studies if there's time. Some earlier work in an article developed this idea, and the book really refines that idea and expands it in very, very significant and somewhat different ways than the article that it's kind of was its progenitor does. Now, another thing that I argue for in chapter 2 of the book is that these dimensions, this kind of practical fruitfulness seems to be domain specific to the normative. So it really is specific to concepts like justice, solidarity, goodness, normative concepts. And I think that the initial contrast between a physical theory and a theory of justice should help to give you a sense of what I'm after, but I'll talk about that more in the second part of the talk. So first, I'm going to briefly motivate the account of fruitfulness for normative concepts here and look at a few case studies where we can actually use empirical research to get a grip on whether or not particular moral and political concepts are able to help us solve practical problems. So in terms of theoretical motivation for this project, which I think is very, very important, the idea that morality or moral theory differs from other areas of kind of purely theoretical reflection is not a new one. I traced this back when I was kind of starting writing this project to remarks by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, where he holds that we study ethics for a different reason than we study other areas of philosophy and subject matters. He's clearly in some ways referring to and kind of disagreeing with his teacher Plato on this. But he says in book two, uh, we're not conducting this inquiry in order to know what virtue is. So Nicomachean Ethics is about virtue, right? But in order to become good. So that's a practical aim, becoming good, right? As opposed to merely knowing what it is to be good. You could study, you might think, what goodness is until you're blue in the face without knowing very much about becoming good, what it would take to be good or how to make yourself better. But Aristotle disagrees with this very sharp distinction between moral theory and moral practice. So for him, the study of ethics has a point to help us figure out how to live our lives in the best way. And I'm taking inspiration for Aristotle. I'm not wedded to anything as strong as his claim. He goes on to say that there would be no point in studying ethics if we couldn't garner information about how to become good from it. I'm not going to say anything so radical as that, but just this broader idea that there could be a practical point to moral and also political philosophy. That's kind of an Aristotelian claim, the most minimal Aristotelian kind of claim that um, I want to draw on. Now, notably, normative concepts like justice and goodness, right? I want to suggest that they arose in response to adaptive pressures that our ancestors faced, right, in evolution related to the need for collective and cooperative living. So you might think that the reason why we have the concept of justice in the first place has to do with certain needs that people had to figure out how to distribute resources fairly, to figure out what kinds of punishments are fitting for certain kinds of transgressions, and so on, how to distribute responsibilities across groups. Um, to kind of slightly paraphrase a remark from John Adams, if we were angels, you might think, there would be no need for justice. He said there would be no need for politics, but you might think that there would be no need for justice for perfect beings who always did, things that were perfectly pro-social, perfectly altruistic. And that to me is kind of like a key into this practical approach to normative concepts. If the reason why we have them around in the first place is to help us solve various practical problems, right? Then we should think about whether the concepts that we're using now are actually helping us to solve the problems that we currently face. And if they're not, perhaps we should be seeking out other kinds of conceptions and perhaps concepts entirely. Moral and political concepts can be and often are evaluated in terms of their fruitfulness in my sense of the term, how well they help us to solve practical problems that we, in many cases, inevitably face as human beings. And as I said, many moral and political philosophers are committed to the fruitfulness of normative concepts mattering to their evaluation. And I like to, so going back to the cover of the book, so fruit is pretty obvious why fruit would be on the cover, but why is there a key sticking out of this pomegranate that's open? So I liken, so Christine Korsgaard, famous kind of Kantian philosopher, argues that normative concepts are solutions to practical problems. I take that in a more empirical direction than she does, but I use this analogy to locks and keys, that the practical problems that we face in social life, in the world, are kind of like locks that we have to open. And normative concepts are, if they help us to solve those practical problems, they're like keys that help us to unlock those problems, right? So justice can be seen as a key that helps us unlock problems of distribution and setting terms of interaction that are acceptable to all, things like that. Now, of course, there is another tradition in moral and political philosophy that eschews this idea of fruitfulness, aligning much more closely with Plato's views than those of Aristotle that I've just mentioned. And according to this line of normative inquiry, moral and political concepts are no different than non-normative concepts in the sense that the practical roles that they might play should be completely extrinsic to our evaluations of them. So maybe like your judgment about the physical theory in case one, you might think it's unfortunate that this scientific discovery has these bad practical effects, but that doesn't really affect whether or not it's a good scientific theory, nor should the practical effects of our moral and political theories really go into our evaluations of them. That's a coherent line of thinking. I think it's wrong. And I'm not going to, in this talk, meet it head on. I'm mostly going to kind of build up what you get out of this other approach, which takes fruitfulness to be directly part of the evaluation of these concepts and show you kind of like what you get out of taking that approach, what kinds of relationships between ethics and science you can get, a kind of plausible picture of how these concepts relate to the reasons why we have them in the first place, as I mentioned before. Um, but I think that this is really a fundamental disagreement about not only the nature of concepts like justice, but about what we should be doing when we're doing moral and political theory. And fundamental disagreements are difficult to attack head on. It's often better to kind of, I try to think of my book as an intervention that aims at a kind of more neutral reader and tries to say, if you were ambivalent about which of these approaches to take, here's what you would get out of mine. Here are all the nice things that you can get from adopting my kind of view. I also try to talk in the conclusion about why actually these approaches don't have to really be so distinct. And as long as they make room for one another, we can have more and less practically informed and practically engaged forms of moral and political philosophy working together at the same time. But I do want to, just for a second, draw on this lock and key analogy. So you could think about key makers, right, who are developing, right, so locksmiths, right, they're developing keys to open locks, and over time, maybe these keys become more refined. We learn that a certain kind of handle provides the right kind of grip that actually helps us to open the lock a bit better, right? Maybe theories are a little bit like that, like the initial normative concepts that we had in our evolutionary past, right? We've refined them in various ways, and that's a good thing. Maybe they need to change as we change, as we realize that we can better solve our problems with better kinds of concepts. But there's a danger here, right? So we can move from locks that, sorry, keys that help us to unlock these practical problems, right? We can start to get very, very focused on the enterprise of key making itself, to the point where we start developing increasingly intricate and ornate keys that are kind of divorced from the initial purpose why we had keys around in the first place. And that's what I want to suggest can happen when moral and political philosophy move too far away from these kinds of lessons about fruitfulness that I think are really a deep part, not only of their evolutionary history, but of what they do in our practical lives, in our legal institutions, in our political institutions, and in our interactions with one another all the time. Okay, so that's another use of the lock and key analogy. It's that you still have to think about the ultimate purpose for which you have these concepts, right? For which we have these keys. If we focus too much on key making independent of this practical purpose, we'll lose sight of that. So again, to understand which normative concepts can solve the practical problems that they are supposed to solve, empirical facts come into play. And there are 5 dimensions in my account of normative fruitfulness, and I'm going to go through them somewhat quickly. You can touch on any questions in the Q&A. The first is what I call motivational fruitfulness. How people will act when a concept is internalized. So, and again, by concept, I'm including norms, theories, and principles that fall under that concept or conception of the concept. So it's not uncommon for philosophers to be concerned with evaluating moral and political concepts in terms of the effects that would result from their adoption. In examining these effects, one natural question to ask is how people will act when they actually internalize and employ these concepts. When people have the concept of justice in their head, right? How does that impact their behavior? So some examples of commitments to motivational fruitfulness can be found in, for instance, what's called the self-effacingness objection to consequentialism. So consequentialism is the moral theory that the right act is the one that has the best overall consequences. And then you can measure those consequences. If you're a utilitarian, you measure those consequences in terms of pleasure and pain or utility. There are other forms of consequentialism. But the objection, the self-effacingness objection to consequentialism is that if people internalize consequentialism, so if they adopt that as their moral theory, they'll be less likely to perform right actions by the consequentialist's own lights. Namely, they'll be less likely to perform acts that have the best overall consequences for all kinds of reasons. There's this thought that people will be self-interestedly, thinking that their actions that actually serve themselves will have good consequences for the group, or they'll be likely to use other people as a means in all kinds of instrumentalizing and exploitative ways under the guise of realizing good overall consequences, maximizing efficiency or something like that. So I'm not saying that this is actually a good objection to consequentialism. I'm just pointing out that philosophers are already kind of on the hook, some of them at least, if they accept this objection to consequentialism for thinking that motivational fruitfulness of the kind that I'm talking about matters in the evaluation of a theory. And that would be surprising to some of those theorists, because some of those theorists are not particularly keen on empirical research being part of philosophy. And assessing the fruitfulness of concepts, assessing what will happen when people internalize a theory, that's an empirical question. That's not a question that you can know the answer to from the armchair alone. And more recently, the literature on our duties to the global poor has really focused a lot on this question of what I call motivational fruitfulness. Peter Singer famously argues that principles of beneficence generate stringent moral duties to help people in severe poverty in developing countries. If you've heard of the shallow pond argument, there's this idea that just from the fact of helping other people, being beneficent, you can generate very strong duties to give a significant portion of our income to some of the world's worst off people. Alison Jagger and Thomas Pogge have taken a different tack and argued that principles of justice generate more stringent duties against committing harm that have been violated by the affluent against the global poor. So it's not merely that we're failing to help people in developing countries. We, the argument goes, as citizens of democratic countries, are causally relevant to the harms that these people are suffering. We're not just coming along with the opportunity to help, but we're actively harming them. And when you harm someone, you have more reason to help them than if you merely find them there in need of help, right? Now, interestingly, in this literature, people have made various claims about the motivational fruitfulness of different ways of looking at these arguments. So Pogge, Judith Lichtenberg, and Holly Lawford Smith are some of the theorists who have argued that not only is the negative duty argument a good argument, but it'll be more motivating than a positive duty argument like Singer's, because if people really accept the idea that they're doing harm to the global poor, that should be more motivating than just the mere idea that they could help them, that they haven't harmed them, but they could help them or something like that. That's drawing on act-omission bias you might be familiar with in psychology, or what's called the doing-allowing distinction. On the other hand, though, negative duty arguments might not succeed in being more motivating because people might not really find it very plausible that they, as ordinary citizens, are harming people in developing countries across the world. So Lichtenberg puts this point in terms of what she calls the paradox of negative and positive duties. Now, interestingly, for a long time, this discussion was almost entirely speculative. Like many these theorists were trying to draw on social scientific research, but now we are using empirical research methods to actually examine these and other related claims about motivational fruitfulness. And I'll walk you through a couple of studies that my research teams have run. They're some of the first studies to have ever looked at the motivational fruitfulness of philosophical arguments. What happens in terms of people's behavior when they actually accept these arguments? Um, so first study that I'll talk about compares the motivational fruitfulness of a Singer-style rational appeal, which we added some content to, with the motivational profile or the effectiveness of a prominent type of image-based emotional appeal, as used in a famous paper by Deborah Small and colleagues, what are known as in the literature on charitable donation and behavior, the Rokia studies. So this is a paper that came out in 2020 that we wrote. So I won't read this whole thing, but basically we presented one group of subjects with a rational appeal, which is a philosophical argument, which largely argues something like what Singer had been arguing in the initial shallow pond argument, that if at very little cost to ourselves, we could save children who are at risk of dying, we ought to do so, right? If we saw a child drowning in a shallow pond in front of us, it would be monstrous to ignore the life of that child. Yet, for very little um, in terms of sacrifice to ourselves, right? We could save the lives of many, many children in similar situations in developing countries. So we ought to do so. So that text was read by participants in one condition, and we checked for attention and various other kinds of factors to make sure they were comprehending the condition. And then the emotional appeal that we compared the effects of this argument to was the following one. And this image was given to us to use by Oxfam, I think Oxfam Australia. So they provided us with this image, and the text is very, very minimal. We're basically saying, in this case, this is Aisha. She lives in Chad, and she's been greatly benefited by charitable work of effective organizations, right? So we don't have her suffering in charity because we had learned through research that actually positive images of children who benefit from charitable giving are much more productive in terms of getting donations. So we really wanted to give the emotional appeal a run for its money. Um, and what was really surprising is that actually, when you look at the results, we also had conditions where we did both types of appeals in the two different orders. So first the argument and then the emotional appeal, and then another condition, the fourth one on this bar graph, has the emotional appeal coming first. But the striking thing that I want to point out to you about what we found in this paper is that the rational appeal, first of all, significantly increased donations over the control condition. So you might have thought, philosophy is kind of this abstract thing, very divorced from the world, but it turns out that certain kinds of moral arguments can actually, on their own, increase donations toward people suffering in severe poverty. And another really interesting point is that the effects of this philosophical argument that we developed were not significantly different than the very, very strong type of emotional appeal on donations. And that's kind of a striking effect, given that so much of the literature on charitable giving had concluded that, like, really you should be hitting people up from an emotional perspective if you want to motivate them to give to charity. That rationality not only can be impotent, but is sometimes counterproductive. So this was a pretty striking result, and it speaks to the motivational fruitfulness, I want to say, of uh, of philosophical arguments. It's the kind of thing that I'm interested in. I'm going to skip over my second case study, which just compared different arguments and showed that they can both differ from controls in some cases, but engages a little bit with this charitable giving literature. But what I'll say is just that these effects have been replicated. This is the last point on this slide by Eric Schwitzgabel and colleagues and Kirsten Brody in a recent paper had an argument contest, and actually one of the arguments that Peter Singer and I submitted won a contest among arguments that were selected according to very strict criteria to make sure that they didn't have emotional content. So the picture for the motivational fruitfulness of philosophical arguments, at least certain arguments, is looking pretty good according to the current research. Okay, so the other dimensions of fruitfulness. So prevention, this is how people will be not motivated to act, but prevented from acting when a certain concept is internalized. So in addition to looking at the effects of normative concepts in promoting certain kinds of behavior, empirical research could be useful in assessing the ability of normative concepts to prevent harmful behaviors, right? So if I'm committed to a certain way of thinking about justice or virtue, maybe I'll be less likely to perform certain kinds of antisocial actions, for instance. Um, and there's quite a bit of empirical work suggesting that, contrary to prior research, we can use moral judgments to regulate our emotions prospectively. So, particularly in the work of people like Keith Payne, you find evidence that people who are thinking about egalitarianism and the importance of treating others as equals can actually head off the effects of bias and prejudice in their actions in various experimental setups. A third criterion is kind of related, but it's whether when it's called, I call it resilience fruitfulness. It's whether when certain concepts compete with bias and other problematic social phenomena, which are more effective in helping us to fight back. And here I'm drawing on work by Sally Haslanger, who has argued that certain concepts of gender and race not only might be desirable from a theoretical perspective, but would have better practical effects than others. Says, at the most general level, the task is to develop accounts of gender and race that will be effective tools in the fight against injustice. And she means real world fight. She doesn't mean, purely in some kind of modeling exercise. Um, and I want to say that this practical task, if you're going to make a claim like that, it has to be evaluated and evaluable, at least empirically, right? So we can't just speculate about what the effects of different concepts of gender and race or justice will be. We have the tools to start this kind of work. So it's in its infancy. It's not that so much of this kind of work has been done, but the book is kind of a call to do more of this kind of work about social and political and moral concepts with regard to pressing social, political, and moral problems. Um, the the fourth dimension of my theory of normative fruitfulness is what I call consensus fruitfulness. So whether certain concepts are better subjects of consensus among people with other commitments that might differ, but that are consistent with goodwill and a desire for peaceful coexistence. So here I'm drawing some inspiration from John Rawls, who was thinking about what should justice look like in a multicultural society? So how can you get people to align on ideas of justice for how the political system should work when they disagree about so much else? So they have very different religious or non-religious beliefs, right? They have different views about what a good life is. And so he thought that it was a practical question whether or not he tries to develop a theory around the idea of an overlapping consensus for such people, a liberal theory of justice that Muslims and Jewish people and atheists and Christians and Buddhists and all kinds of people could come together on in a multicultural society, right? But that is an empirical question. I think he recognizes that. It turns out that some of his predictions about what would be found in empirical settings meant to model his original position thought experiment that some of you might be familiar with were probably wrong. So it turns out that the principles of justice that Rawls predicted that people would select um, were actually dispreferred in comparison to what's called a restricted utilitarian principle. And I won't go into detail of what these principles are, but I think that Rawls would probably recognize that either he had to critique the setup of the experiments or concede that this is a problem for his theory. So I think he put himself on the hook for thinking that the practical implementation of his theory mattered. I have various passages where he says things that clearly show that he's committed to that. Now, some people have argued against the idea that we would ever be able to find a single, uniquely choice-worthy set of principles of justice for all different kinds of people to align on. And Justin Brunner and I, one of my colleagues, have actually thought more generally about the procedure through which we select principles of justice. So for people in philosophy, it's not just the question of what principles follow from the original position that we should be looking at, but whether people think that the original position itself is the right way of thinking about how to select those principles. There are other options. So people might be aware of like an impartial spectator model, which comes out of the work of theorists like David Hume and Adam Smith. Um, and I won't go through this case study in detail, but what's interesting is that a very non-Rawlsian setup of both principles, so an impartial spectator model with restricted utilitarian principles, tended to win out in various studies that looked at these kinds of comparisons. And maybe this is actually empirically the best kind of candidate for a conception of justice that could achieve consensus. I talk about this in chapter 4 of the book. That's all about political philosophy. And the last form of fruitfulness that I talk about in the book is what I call guidance fruitfulness, whether or not certain concepts provide more useful prescriptions about how to act in solving practical problems than others. Many philosophers hold that a moral theory should be action guiding. It's a classical objection to virtue ethics that supposedly, virtue theory just tells us do as the virtuous person would do. It talks about what that virtuous person is like, but it doesn't tell us what to do. That's supposed to be a problem. I actually think from an empirical perspective, that's not a very fair critique of virtue theory, but someone who made that objection is kind of on the hook for thinking that what I call guidance fruitfulness matters in the evaluation of virtue theory and its competitors. I'm going to skip over some of this. This is just pointing out various theorists of justice and freedom and race and welfare who have argued that the action guidance that theories give rise to is relevant to the evaluation of that theory itself, of that particular type of concept. Okay, so I'm going to move a little bit more quickly now. So now you know the dimensions of the theory. Um, Now I'm going to raise a few concerns about whether or not this account can generalize to non-normative concepts. Like, is this really specific to morality and political justice? So recall our starting contrast cases, right? We expect very different things, I want to say, from a theory of subatomic particles and a theory of justice. And we should. These are different areas of inquiry that respond to different types of problems, something that Aristotle also thought. Now, there are three key contrasts between normative concepts like justice and solidarity and scientific classificatory concepts that are often discussed as other types of concepts we might evaluate in this literature called conceptual engineering. And I want to bring out these three kind of key concepts that'll help to give people a sense, hopefully non-philosophers too, of what I'm after here, why I think this is specific to moral and political concepts, this theory. So one is the kind of purposes of the concepts. Um, the primary purpose of normative concepts is not the classification of the natural world, like the concept of planet or allele or electron is, but rather the purpose of concepts like justice is to help us to resolve problems that arise in collective and cooperative living. Now, that might just be kind of restating my view, right? So I'll go into a little bit more detail. So another point is the relevant communities here. The contrast in the communities to which these concepts are put for use. So in the case of scientific concepts, it's primarily the community of scientific experts, right? While science must sometimes be communicated to the public for policy development, right, and coordination on best practices, it's not the case that in order to be good scientific concepts, they have to be understandable to the general public, usually. There's no criticism of a given conception of planet or electron or allele that the ordinary person may have trouble understanding them or employing them in their daily lives. Morality, on the other hand, I want to say, in order to solve its problem-solving purposes, it has to be engaged with by ordinary people, and it has to set the terms of their interactions. You couldn't have moral theories that solve practical problems without getting buy-in from ordinary people and being employable by them. Here's a funny image of kind of comedic and lighthearted protests that sprung up around the country when the International Astronomical Union decided that Pluto should no longer be regarded as one of the canonical planets. It was relegated to dwarf planet status, right, for various theoretical reasons. And the whole joke here that these people, they're smiling. That's the discoverer of Pluto's sun in the front with the yellow shirt, Clyde Tombaugh's son. Um, it's a joke because it should ordinary people shouldn't have really standing to protest what counts as a planet, right? What counts as a planet should be determined by what is most suitable to astronomy, right? And to the study of celestial bodies, right? So the whole joke is, in the hilarious science is that it's really not our say, and we're having kind of fun with this idea, right? Um, Interestingly, the Illinois State Senate, I believe, tried to overturn the idea. They tried to reject this idea that Pluto should no longer be a canonical planet because Clyde Tombaugh was from Illinois, I believe. And you might think that's the wrong kind of reason to reject a change to the classification of planets, right? Um, but maybe not so for morality. If moral theories really jar against people's ordinary judgments and just cannot be used by them in reliable ways, then that would be a deeper problem. Another point here, the third key contrast is in terms of accountability holding practices. So we wouldn't blame ordinary people for having the wrong scientific views, right? Um, Presumably many of us have many, many, many wrong scientific views. But we do hold ordinary people accountable for having the wrong moral views, and in particular for drawing the wrong moral conclusions. So in the case of the small group of non-scientists who genuinely rejected the 2006 revised definition of planet, what we criticize them for is a moral failing of a kind. They're failing to defer to the experts, right? They're engaged in a kind of intellectual hubris, right? It's not the fact that they don't grasp or know the relevant scientific claims, right? People who promote the wrong moral views and act on them, on the other hand, are often subject to blame and held accountable in various ways, ridicule, shaming, and punishment, and that can be appropriate. But if a scientific theory is merely incorrectly held by a person and their assent to it involves no foreseeable harm to others, it's not plausible that we're entitled to blame them in the moral sense of the term, let alone sanction or punish them. Moral concepts, by contrast, they have to be accessible to ordinary people if the distinctive practices of, again, accountability holding, right, blaming, promising, and so on, that they figure in are to be justified. Many theorists have argued for what's called this publicity requirement, both for moral and political concepts, right? So the rule of law instantiates this very idea that for moral concepts, they have to be the kind of thing, laws have to be accessible to the people who are being held to legal standards, right? In order for those laws to function properly. Much of our moral thinking depends on the idea that people can only be held to normative standards that they can, in principle, understand, endorse, and apply to themselves. And that's why I think that this theory of the kind of practical role of normative concepts just is very, very distinctive. The kinds of practices and problem-solving potentials that they have are just very, very different from the things that we expect of, for instance, scientific classificatory concepts. And this is partly an intervention into the conceptual engineering literature, where I think that people too often slide between normative and non-normative concepts when thinking about how we should engineer or change the concepts that we are working with for practical reasons. There are very, very different kinds of practical criteria at play, I want to say, in the two cases. And chapter 2 is all about that if you're interested in that question. Okay, so I don't want to take up too much time responding to objections that people in the Q&A might have, but I'll say a couple of the obvious ones I'll give kind of quick responses to. So one is that my theory involves some kind of pernicious form of relativism, that the focus on normative fruitfulness seems to imply that what's fruitful and therefore which moral and political concepts are most choice-worthy, they might vary across time and place, right? Because we might find different empirical effects of our concepts in different times and places, is the idea. My response is, well, perhaps this is a feature and not a bug of the view. There's good reason to think that moral and political concepts emerge in different times and places as solutions to the particular practical problems that human beings face. If you think about work on religious toleration and liberalism, it's no accident that that work arose during conflicts over religious toleration in Europe, right? And I think that this fact also helps to explain why contemporary moral problems like severe economic inequality and climate change can sometimes jar against our existing moral concepts, like concepts of strong property rights that we have, or strong views of the limits of government intervention, or the kinds of harms that ordinary people are responsible for addressing. The concepts that we're working with are kind of being outmoded. Um, we're kind of facing new practical problems that our concepts are not really well designed to help us to address. And so we're going to have to do, I think, more philosophy, more empirically informed philosophy, to develop new ways of looking at those problems. And so that I think this way of responding to the objection lends itself to that kind of view. Another point is that my theory is only partially relativistic because many problems, like the need to divide resources in ways that are acceptable to all, the fact that we have inadequate concern for certain others in many cases, these problems are general to human beings and human societies. Some of these problems are ones that we inevitably have to solve as moral agents interacting with one another and also with other sentient creatures. Don't forget about them. Now, similar solutions, namely similar, concepts, might work on the same problem in different contexts, different times, places, cultures, and ambient environments, taking that term from Philip Kitcher. Um, but it's possible that different contexts might require different solutions for the same problem, right? So that could help. I think this theory helps to explain certain kinds of cultural diversity in moral concepts that it's not that there are some bad people over there and we're the good people. It's that we have different concepts. We have different ways of looking at morality and justice that are, uh, in the best scenario, they're aimed at solving practical problems in their own ways because our environments differ, right? But our contexts are also not walled off from one another. And this is a really important point. We need solutions to the problem of overlapping contexts, right? The fact that we interact with people from different cultural backgrounds and different regions of the world all the time, right? Increasingly so, right? So this is one way of interpreting Rawls's later project in the Law of Peoples. He's trying to develop the idea of an overlapping consensus about justice, not within one society, but across societies. And insofar as that problem is not going away anytime soon, we will have certain kinds of non-relativistic, at least not, uh, we'll have certain kinds of problems that are relativistic only perhaps temporally, right? It might be that across time the solutions to those problems change, but in terms of geographical region, it's a global problem that we have to solve. And then the second point is the last objection that I'll consider, which is that this theory is kind of overly concessive. This is like a key problem that theorists like Jerry Cohen and David Estlin more recently would have with the kind of empirically informed moral theory that I'm arguing for. So they think that insofar as you make your theory of justice sensitive to practical facts and empirical considerations, it will be too concessive to faults in human nature. So by focusing on human nature and facts about our psychology, we'll tend to downgrade our moral expectations of one another. Oh, people can't bring themselves to give more to charity, so therefore we're not required to give more to charity. That seems a bit daft, right? That seems way too concessive. Um, but that's only one way in which this kind of relationship could go, is what I want to say in response. Attention to empirical facts need not be used to excuse our moral failings. And in fact, if you care about, the second point is that if you care about making the world better, if you care about promoting justice, right? If you care about your theory being part of promoting justice, you'd better have that theory be uh, sensitive to empirical facts about human nature. Instead, I want to say empirical research can be used to explore which moral and political concepts tend to produce the best human behavior, the strongest forms of cooperation, and so on. So in slogan form, the focus is on optimization rather than concession. So those are two of the major objections. I like to make things harder for myself in various ways. So I'm gonna leave out the third objection, and maybe people who are reading really quickly will get one on their list, but you probably don't need that at all. Um, so I'm just going to conclude here with what I take to be the most important upshots of the view. So one really nice, I said that I wasn't going to reject this alternative non-empirical picture head on. I was going to try to see what you get out of, the proof is in the pudding. So taste the product, right? Here are the things that you get out of this way of thinking about moral and political philosophy. And if you think that they are benefits, if you think that these are attractive features, that might be one reason to be on my side of this kind of fundamental disagreement. So one thing we get is a new account of the way that science can inform ethics and political philosophy. I mean ethics very broadly here. We get an explanation of why empirical research is part of, rather than merely of interest to, moral and political philosophy, tied to deep tendencies in these areas of philosophical inquiry. Now, the theory of fruitfulness from normative concepts may be generalizable to other domains, but I argue that, as I've said in the second part of the talk, I think there are difficulties for that view given the distinct nature of normative concepts. This also opens up the kind of recursive question of the fruitfulness of broader and narrower ways of thinking about fruitfulness, like is a more domain-specific account of fruitfulness better able to help us solve practical problems of the kind that the theory itself is aimed at? I don't really address this question in the book very much, but at least on the narrower account, as I see it, this domain-specific account, I want to argue that accuracy is improved, even if generality is reduced. Notably, we don't have to go in for a full-on pragmatism to get a plausible account of why fruitfulness matters in the evaluation of normative concepts, and why empirical research is therefore part of moral and political philosophy. So if you're a full-on pragmatist, you'll probably be on board with everything I had to say, but if you don't want to be a pragmatist about things like physical theories from the first example, then you can still accept everything that I've had to say. Now, of course, I would welcome it if my account did extend to other non-normative domains, or I've talked about moral and political concepts. There are also technically other normative domains, like the aesthetic domain, or some people think the epistemic domain has various normative qualities. Really, here by normative, I just meant moral and political. I would welcome it if my account extended to these other normative and non-normative domains. But even if such a project could be pulled off, it'll be important, I want to conclude by saying, not to lose sight of what is distinctive about fruitfulness for normative concepts of the kind that we focused on here. So here are some of my research collaborators from the projects that I've mentioned tonight. Thank you for listening to this talk. My website and email address if you want to get in contact with me. And it so happens that I have a discount code for my book for anyone who doesn't have a copy and wants to order it. I know that academic books are quite expensive, but I've been asked by my publisher to distribute this code. So yeah, so thanks so much for attending the talk, and I look forward to discussing this with you in the remaining time.
Fantastic. Um, thank you, Matthew, for that. I've been taking notes. I've been learning along with you. I think before we move to question and answers, I have a couple of questions for you, and then we'll move it to opening it up for questions and comments. So this is the time to start thinking about what you want to ask, and if you want, you can write it in the chat or just put your hands up. But before we jump to that, as you were talking, I was thinking, this book is making a really substantive intervention in philosophy. And I think you're giving us a sense of what you're calling on philosophers to do. But the book is also provocation, right? And as I was reading it, I could see how some traditional philosophers will be provoked by it, right? And so I was wondering if you could talk to us about how you see them responding to the provocation and how would you respond to their concerns?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. So sometimes when you present an idea on its own, it's not always obvious the way in which it's kind of breaking with the mold. So, um, I have tenure now. It's kind of a nice accident that this project came out when I already have tenure because I can be a bit more bold about various things. Um, so in many ways, chapter 3 of the book really tries to head off many of these objections, but I think that there are other ways, and it's not just that people might find various problems with the arguments or things to disagree with. I actually think that in some ways, the idea that philosophy not only can but ought to engage with work from the empirical sciences can be seen as threatening to people who, for one thing, are not always trained in empirical research methods. So they might have been trained in philosophy departments before kind of the revolution in experimental philosophy that happened not so long ago, right? Seems long as I'm getting older, it's actually longer ago, but 30 years ago or something like that. Um, so that's one thing, just from a kind of sociological perspective that I think could be going on. But I think more generally, there is a valid critique, right? You don't want philosophy to just be completely indistinct from other fields. You might think maybe that would be threatening to our claim to have philosophy departments or something like that, right? Um, Now, I don't really have that view about the modern university. I really think that, we separate out into different departments, but many of us in psychology and philosophy are actually working on the same kinds of questions. Um, Part of what I want to do to allay people's worries in this kind of camp in the conclusion of the book is to say there's still a whole lot of work to be done in traditional theoretical philosophy that's not empirical at all. So in particular, I argue that these kind of fruitfulness considerations only really come into play once your concepts, arguments, whatever your item that you're evaluating is already well motivated from a theoretical perspective. So we don't try to evaluate the fruitfulness factors of invalid arguments. That would be like mere rhetoric or something, sophistry, right? So I'm not interested in that. I want to argue that the practical considerations come into play when we already have good theoretical reasons to accept the kinds of philosophical ideas that we're evaluating. And that means that there's a huge amount of work that's kind of purely theoretical still left to be done. Um, so hopefully with whatever does threaten people about the project, I think I've taken a lot of steps toward them to try to say you can accept a lot of what I have to say.
Yeah, provoke, not threaten, but maybe threaten too. But that's okay. That's how we sort of grow our disciplines. And that brings me to the last question I wanted to ask you before we open up for other comments is, you know, I'm trained as a political scientist.
Mhm.
And I'm always like, listen to the philosophers, but I am trained as a political scientist. And so I'm wondering for those of us who are outside the field of philosophy, right?
Mm.
Say the social sciences or saying other humanity disciplines, what is your message to us?
Yeah, my message is some of us are very, very willing to learn from and work with you. I love collaborating with people in other fields, in economics and psychology and other fields. And I think that what I've tried to do, so I talk about one way of looking at this is that people just will work together, and that's a nice thing. They'll produce work, that's interdisciplinary, and that's all well and good. And we could just say it doesn't really matter that we stop and kind of consider whether or not that's philosophy or whether or not that contributes to philosophy. I've sometimes called that the kind of unspoken agreement. Like I do the philosopher part, you do the empirical political scientist part. We just write a paper, people like it, it gets cited, and everything is fine. And that can be good, right? If it generates discussion and so on. But I think we could the project of the book, I'm actually not, maybe I'm a more anxious type of personality, but I sort of wanted to go beyond that kind of like everything is fine approach and say, is everything fine, right? I think we can actually provide a self-conscious defense of working together. So I think this fruitfulness approach really explains why psychology and history and anthropology and behavioral economics, for instance, are part of doing good philosophy, engaging with those disciplines, and philosophers sometimes rolling up their sleeves and doing experiments themselves. Why that's important for making philosophical progress. I think we can say more than just that it generates good work. We can talk about why that makes philosophical progress and why that's philosophically significant.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I'm going to open it up for questions. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat and I'll read it, or you're welcome to raise your hands or a comment. Doesn't have to be a question. I think Matthew raised a lot of things for us to respond to and engage with. There is a couple of questions. in the chat. The first one says, is there some sort of competing or conflicting nature between your fruitful criteria? If so, this may result in one of your fruitful criteria suppressing another. Is this bound to happen? Is this a bad thing? Can we account for this? And then I have
So
another question.
this question comes from one of my star students, Musa Sisse, who was in my Foundations of Ethics class. And as an undergraduate, he read significant portion of the manuscript while I was writing it. So um, look out for him. He's coming to my lab. So he actually, he sent me like a list of 10 or 12 objections after he read it, like, in a week. So, okay, enough bragging about my student. Yeah, so there are conflicts between these criteria that we should think about, and one that I consider in the book is really it's between achieving broader consensus, right? So a concept of justice that's like really widely accepted, right? And maybe a way of thinking about justice, for instance, that's most useful to activists, most useful to people who are most concerned about, say, the struggle against racism or against transphobia, for instance, or against misogyny, right? So those conflicts can happen. You can see how something that's more widely accepted could have to be like more diluted, less radical, right? So one thing that I'll just say is that the fact of competing demands or competition between virtues of a theory is not, this is kind of like the defensive philosopher move. It's not specific to my theory, right? We know that in discussions in philosophy of science about theory selection, there are trade-offs between explanatory power and simplicity, for instance, in the sciences, right? That's a kind of common example, right? And just in ordinary life, like bring it down to ordinary life, like being as good a parent as you can sometimes conflict with like being as good a friend as you can be to someone who's like, waiting for you to meet up after you put your kids to bed. Like you might be later if you spend more time reading bedtime stories. So competing demands are everywhere. It's not unique to my theory. How do I look at this particular competing demand? I actually think that the theory itself can help us to make progress with some of these competing demands. So in particular, when it comes to achieving broad consensus fruitfulness, and what I called resilience fruitfulness, what is most powerful in fighting back? What I say in chapter 3, in the objections chapter, is that perhaps we should favor the kind of concept that will be most useful to the most committed agents, and we should prefer that kind of way of looking at a concept like justice or solidarity or whatever, or gender or race, to the concept that would be mostly widely accepted, insofar as those people who are most committed are really trying to get to the heart of the social problem. They're more likely to give rise to social change. But that never means that we forget the other criteria, right? Just like you don't forget your friends just because you care a lot about being a parent, right? Um, you still need to think about whether or not you're alienating large amounts of the general population, right? And then even among the most committed people, there will be differences that need to be navigated in terms of consensus building, right? So I don't think that the conflicts, as with many things in life, the conflicts don't go away, but I think that the theory, insofar as it focuses on practical problem solving, actually helps us to make a little bit of progress. We don't have to just throw up our hands and say, oh, these criteria compete with one another, so there's nothing more to say. Great
And
question.
then Clifton sent out a question in the chat. What are some current research work you find interesting when it comes to the creation of concepts? I find it one thing to discuss implementation of concepts versus the creation of concepts, especially as we are interacting with other people in a complex environment.
Yeah, that's interesting. My focus really is on the evaluation of existing concepts for the most part. Um, I guess that I am sort of interested in how cultures develop new ways of looking at values and how that can lead to social progress. I think so if you're just looking in kind of like our public political culture, I'll go on the record and say like there are many things about wokeness that are wonderful, like this package of commitments to egalitarianism and this idea that we should be, critically evaluating our privileges and learning from people who are historically marginalized. So you could see that as the development of a social concept of a way, maybe it's a kind of virtue, being being woke, right? Now, of course, there are, endless critiques, and I'm not really in the business of, uh, you know, I can accept that there can be excesses of, my own commitments without thinking that those things are uh, you know, fatal or something like that to a whole worldview. Notice that we're living through a period of reaction to those things, and that raises certain questions about the practical effects of those beliefs, but also, you know, the arc of history is long. There have been periods of reaction, 1848 before, to moral progress, and we're living through one, and it's only challenging moral concepts and social movements that provoke reaction from the forces of reaction. So I'm hopeful for the future, but that would be just when I think about like concepts that have been created recently that really seem to be like really effectual in the world. I would think that wokeness is probably one.
Other comments or questions from Matthew? Danielle, jump in.
Thank you, Matthew, for Matt for the presentation. I'm in Istanbul, so it's the middle of the night here. So
Oh, thank you for coming.
I'm a little asleep, but I didn't want to miss it.
Oh, thanks so much.
But um, so I have a question to understand better your view. In particular, I want to understand why the normative concepts of ethics or moral and political philosophy have this kind of special status that they seem to have that make them different
Mm.
from other kinds of concepts. Uh, Maybe I'll motivate the question. Uh, for example, for a Persian or in general, I think pragmatist philosophers, I think it would be fairly natural to say, given what you have said, I would translate it into my language and say that these normative concepts like theories of justice or what is good or right to do and so on, they're hypotheses that try to solve a problem. They're hypothetical solutions. If we try this hypothesis, this understanding of what is just or what is good, we might be able to solve, the moral conflicts or the political conflicts of a particular society at a particular time, with a given trajectory uh, in their social history and so on. So it would be very natural for me to think that they're just another form of hypotheses. But for you, they seem to be special. So I'm not challenging, but just trying to understand. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I need to take you to coffee and pick your brain about Peirce. I've read a lot of Peirce, but you're a Peirce scholar. Um, I've read Kitcher's work on Peirce. So I'm not in principle against full-blooded, pragmatism. Certainly some of my close friends and colleagues, respected colleagues, are into that. Here's what I will say. I wanted to show that you can accept everything that I have to say without thinking that ethical and moral concepts are just like sort of hypotheses among others, right? And even if you had that kind of broader kind of view, I would want to point out that the ways in which these hypotheses are functioning, they are hypotheses about social and political and moral problems, right? Their subject matter is quite different, and that might lend itself, as I said, to different kinds of criteria for what we want from them. Like what we want from a theory of justice is just so different from what we want from a theory of what a planet is or what an electron is or an allele is, right? There might be middle cases like sex hormone is a case where a concept actually maybe starts off more moralized and then becomes more descriptive. There are different examples in the history of, biology and concept development, for instance. Another, and maybe I need to, maybe I'll eventually change my view, but I am somewhat reluctant to say that all concepts should be evaluated in terms of their practical effects for other kinds of reasons. Like it seems like there are just kind of hard descriptive facts about the world. I understand many of the arguments in like the values in science literature, for instance. But I often think that, there could be arguments for why we ought not to engage in certain kinds of scientific research from a moral perspective, like we shouldn't try to develop this kind of weapon, but it doesn't change the fact that if we develop it, this developed weapon is a thing, and it has certain kinds of scientific credentials. So those are just the kinds of reasons that maybe they're like very boring reasons to a pragmatist for why people resist full-blooded pragmatism. But just from a more like, you know, sort of strength testing of the view, it's sort of like you can accept this view without going for the broader kind of commitment. But I'm open to like bold, big ideas. So
We have
And
no, go ahead, Daniel, go ahead.
I just was thanking Matt for his answer.
And we thank you for your commitment to be here in the middle of the night. Thank you, Daniel.
that's a great colleague.
We're running short on time, and we have a question in the chat, and Professor Arnold has a question. So maybe let me read the question in the chat, go to Professor Arnold, and then have you address both of them. Jessica asked in the chat, do some normative concepts house descriptive concepts like justice? How much of it is it seen normative or seen as descriptive? And then let me ask Professor Arnold to jump in.
Let him answer that, and if we have time, I'll ask my question. Otherwise, it's totally fine.
Go ahead.
Yeah, another star student, Jessica. So thank you for coming. So I don't have, I guess this is, not to do the defensive philosopher thing again. I don't really have a principled view about kind of the degree to which normative concepts house descriptive concepts, but there is this idea of thick concepts that you might be familiar with, right? This idea. So unlike a concept like justice, which is maybe might think is more abstract, maybe has certain kinds of descriptive content, but right, something like what makes a person a coward, right? That involves both a normative judgment about their behavior and also certain kind of descriptive, for instance, predictions about how they'll act in various circumstances, right? Maybe what they've done in the past. Maybe you have to have done descriptively certain things to count as a coward, whereas you can just talk about the concept of justice without necessarily, necessarily talking about descriptive implementation in that kind of way. So I'm not really entirely sure how much of justice is descriptive, but I would say that there could be a continuum of more purely normative and more purely descriptive concepts. And in particular, social concepts like gender and race will often have partially descriptive content and partially normative concept. And interestingly, part of how discrimination often works is by trying to tie descriptive differences that are caused by merely environmental factors, right? Like hair texture and things like that, to normative views about what makes people have those different features. So those kinds of cases are going to be especially important to disentangle, right? The normative and the descriptive content. But it's a great question. I don't know that I have so much that's interesting to say about it, but I hope that's a start.
And let's go to Professor Arnold for the last question.
Yeah, so thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I'm currently teaching our research methods course, and Professor Alonso particularly wanted me and the handful of students from my class here to listen to this because it has been traditional in political science for norms to be excluded from any political analysis. I mean, it's 75%, 80% of things. And so what I find really fascinating, because I'm interested in interdisciplinary work, and is that what is difficult in your discipline would be considered the norm in ours, right? So the notion that you have to make a claim or a case that empirical research is useful is 80% of our field. And at the same time, in particular, I find this interesting because one of the claims that you were sort of putting there was that somehow using empirical research would somehow be less generalizable. Whereas the norm, because 50% of our field is people doing behavioral politics in America, studying American political behavior, that somehow that's the only way to generalize. And so I am curious, because any class I teach is about intellectual history, how you see those tensions work out in your field.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. In the conclusion, I talk a little bit about this. So very often philosophers who reject my kind of view, they want to point to kind of pure mathematics as kind of the model for how you should think about ethics and political philosophy. David Estland in particular has this what he calls like anti-practicalism about morality. And he's saying, there can be all kinds of valuable but purely speculative, fields of inquiry that wind up having practical applications or that don't, but that are intellectually valuable of various kinds, right? Now, I completely agree, but I don't see any good argument for why ethics and political philosophy are more like pure mathematics than like, say, a lot of work that's being done in political science or in psychology, right? Where we take for granted that empirical research can be valuable and illuminating. I think that from a more principled perspective, I guess the way in which we bridge this gap between descriptive data and normative questions about how we ought to live and how we ought to structure a society is an interesting philosophical question. And it's very easy to kind of put those things together and not kind of interrogate that relationship. So the theory is trying to provide a very self-conscious account of how the descriptive questions, the empirical questions, could inform our normative conclusions about which concepts are most choice-worthy, is the term that I use. Um, but it is really interesting, and I think that there are sociological reasons why it's really only in the 20th century and maybe only in the second half of the 20th century that philosophy incurred this real skepticism toward incorporating empirical research. You even see in like early 20th century thinkers and late 19th century thinkers, lots of people who are interested in core questions about human nature. So I think we're moving out of that kind of phase of philosophy, trying to wall itself off from empirical work. And I'm eager to talk to you more about how this looks in other disciplines. But that's a bit of what I would say, both about like how philosophy just is structured in a kind of contingent way by its recent history, but also maybe there is some kind, David Hume's classic is-ought, descriptive normative divide. We have to have answers to how to bridge that, and the book is trying to provide one such answer.
I think the book provides one such. I want to thank you, Matthew, for the book. It's a gift. It is quite approachable, even for a political scientist. I want to encourage people to read it. I want to thank you for this invitation to learn from you and with you. I want to thank others for joining us, for your engagement, and for your questions. At the Wolf Institute, we like to say that we build community by learning together. I think we've done that here tonight. So thank you, everyone, so much for being with us and being part of this community.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Gaston, and thanks for the great questions. Take care. Thanks.